This screencast is looking at the different factors that contribute to development inequalities, why some places are developed and other places aren't. And they can be kind of summed up in 4 different factors: environmental, although we call that physical; economic, social, and political. The physical geography of some countries does not favour development. Africa, for example, has a lot of landlocked countries that are kind of surrounded by other countries so that they don't have sea. This means that it makes trade far less easy because you can't obviously ship things out from those countries. Tropical Africa, South America and Asia tend to be the poorest world regions, and these areas suffer from more climate-related diseases than cooler parts of the world. So it talks about here, blighted by tropical diseases. If they have those diseases, it means people then can't work. If they're not working, they're not producing money and goods to sell and so on. Many people in the tropics are debilitated by malaria and other diseases. HIV and AIDS is a recent health problem from which sub-Saharan Africa has suffered particularly badly. People cannot improve their standard of living when they are so ill, and many children are orphaned. As we can see here, often these less developed countries have poor soils, meaning that growing crops and so on is much harder. Arid conditions are very dry conditions, so again another condition that makes the growing of crops much more difficult in these countries. Finally, climatic hazards such as drought regularly strike Africa, especially places like Ethiopia, Eritrea and Somalia in the east. Now these limit future development and destroy what may already have been achieved. The final physical factors we can see here is about these areas often suffer from natural hazards, for example earthquakes, and then they don't have the money to repair the damage that's caused. And in future screencasts we're going to be looking at case studies of that. Economic factors. So, poverty actually causes poverty. Low life expectancy and low standard of living make it an almost impossible base from which to develop and expand. The poorest countries are those in or just emerging from civil wars. So for example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, Somalia and Sierra Leone are all examples of countries that have had civil wars and are struggling to develop from that. Ethiopia had a successful history, yet today is one of the world's poorest nations due to famine and war. Now Africa is the least industrialised continent, even though there's really cheap labour, processing and value adding is usually done in the purchasing country. Most African exports are primary goods. These are raw materials, and these are less valuable than the processed products that they actually import in. In Africa, the production of export goods employs around 2 million people over the whole continent, which is a fraction of the total population of over 934 million. Companies involved in transnational corporations, or TNCs, so profits go to their bases abroad rather than to African countries and the people within Africa. African governments have sometimes squandered their profits, so trade has been of little help towards true development. Now, a lot of companies have actually been reluctant to invest in Africa due to the political instability, the unreliable services such as electricity for obviously their factories and manufacturing, and a poorly skilled workforce. A country's income is primarily measured by its gross domestic product per capita and the welfare of its people by the Human Development Index, which we've looked at in previous screencasts. In general, when the income is low, so is the level of welfare. So if we go through each of these bullet points, global trade favours developed countries. So we've looked at the fact that developed countries often trade with each other, and the types of goods that they are trading cost a lot of money. So when they export to these poor countries are having to pay a lot of money for it, but actually we buy what we call primary goods from these poor countries at a much lower rate. So poor countries are selling stuff for a little amount of money, but actually having to buy the stuff in, costing a lot of money. Tariffs make trade more expensive. Now tariffs are government taxes on imported or exported goods, so they're adding costs to these poor countries when they're actually trading with them. They produce mainly primary products which don't make much money, which is what we just talked about. So in places like Africa, they export mainly raw materials, things like minerals and petroleum. But they have to import manufactured goods. So they sell stuff for little money, but actually have to spend more money getting it in. And of course they're in debt, as this final bullet point says, and spend money on interest payments rather than development. So having borrowed money from a rich country, they are paying back that money every time they get money and not being able to put the money that they've got into further development. Now, there are a number of social factors that stop countries from development becoming equal. Poor water quality causes disease. This debilitates people and prevents economic development. Many tropical countries suffer from endemic malaria, yellow fever, bilharzia, and river blindness. Diseases are carried in water, and water quality is unreliable. In some countries, rainfall amounts vary hugely through the year, and irrigation may not be an option. Now, of course, as it talks about here, down here, over approximately 2 million people die from water-related illnesses every year in these poor countries. Access to safe water kickstarts development because people obviously drinking water become ill. If they're ill, they can't go to work, children can't go to school, women can work instead of spending all day fetching water if there's a easily accessible water that's clean. If you've got clean water, it's also possible to grow your crops. So countries that develop more easily have good water supplies. They have a good education system. A poor country finds it difficult to fund education for all children to a good level. Investors are put off by the lack of an educated workforce, and so you're in this cycle. Because of the fact that people don't go to school and get educated, the workforce aren't skilled, therefore rich countries don't want to put their manufacturing and factories and so on in a place where they haven't got the workforce that is skilled enough to work for them. Women are able to work and contribute to the economy in countries that are developed, and this is something that doesn't happen in these poor countries. Finally, health. When Sierra Leone got its independence in 1963, it had a health system in place, but as a poor country, it has not been able to maintain this. It is difficult for sick people to work hard, so Sierra Leone's economy has spiralled downwards. It is one of the most distressed countries in the world with an HDI of only 0.0317 in 2010. The final factor that leads to global inequalities is the political factors. So countries find it difficult to develop when there's political instability, because that scares off investment. Wars disrupt the economy, destroy the infrastructure and cause displacement of people. And finally, corrupt governments tap development funds for themselves. All of these reasons stop companies in rich countries actually investing in these poorer countries.